I don't know specifically where I've heard it from. I've just heard it throughout the years that ancient like Celtic cultures used woad for blue. Like, is there any evidence of that, or is that kind of along the same lines as the bog bodies?
It's very much along the same lines. That's
Okay.
one of those rabbit holes where if you fall down it with a sort of objective and um, you know, I would say quality historical approach, so you don't have preconceived notions, you very quickly run into this a very similar issue where basically, as I recall off the top of my head, the entirety of Celtic body decoration traces back to one account from Julius Caesar.
Hmm.
And there are no supporting accounts by other Romans who were stationed in Britain or in Germany. They're just not there. And then you get into some really interesting linguistic things, right? So tattooing was known in the Roman Empire. They had a word for it. They used the word stigma or the root stig, from which we get the modern word stigma. Was their word for tattooing. And when Caesar describes the bodies of these tribal people, he doesn't use that word.
Hmm.
So, so that's an interesting linguistic thing, right? Like why would you
Right.
call a fork a spoon if you knew it was a fork? And
Sure.
so we can't test that. There's actually been some experimental archaeology done with woad,
Yeah.
using it to try to tattoo. And as I recall, it burns like crazy. It's actually kind of
Hmm.
caustic in the skin and pretty unpleasant. And
Okay.
so the people that did that work, as I recall, basically said, the idea of actually like doing large scale black or blue work with this as a pigment seems really crazy,
Hmm.
particularly when you take into account that they had charcoal and carbon and they knew how to make black ink. So why would you use this other thing entirely that's actually bad for you?
Right. Right. Yeah. Because the woad is actually toxic. So that right or something like that. It's not
Yeah,
good
yeah,
for
as I
you.
recall, yeah. At least when you put it in the skin, it's caustic. Yeah,
Sure, sure. Yeah, I think that's probably a huge part too. I'm sure of like, just dealing with the ancient past in general is having to sort through unreliable narrators and, going back and looking at previous studies and I've heard you talk about before in other podcasts that I was listening to that uh you know, it's hard to like what archaeologists maybe previously found in archaeological sites. Maybe they're not looking for a tattooing, so that just gets described as oh, that's a little bone, right? Because you're only going to find a little piece.
yeah.
So
Well, and what you said about history is really important, right? I mean,
yeah,
that's for most of history, that concept, the idea of being a historian, of recording history, it didn't mean the same thing that it does now.
yeah,
And so particularly when you think about, classical authors, these guys, they're making things up left and right. They're plagiarizing each other without citation. Most of them are writing about places they've never visited. Some of them are writing about things that happened 3 or 4 or 500 years in the past. So, we just can't take those narratives as being fact. And that I think is something that gets lost on a lot of people is that, just because something is historical doesn't mean that it's history.
right.
And
It's
so,
right.
yeah. So for example, there's pictures of supposedly tattooed Celts, in the paintings of John White from the 1600s or so, 1600s. And,
Yes.
he made those 3,000 years after the last potentially tattooed Celt died. But we
Right.
look at those and we're like, wow, those are really old paintings. They must be telling us the truth. And yes, you constantly have to be sort of checking what you think you know against what the evidence is and what there might be.